Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Midwestern Marks live stream, the Eddie Liger Power Hour, starting a bit early today. I've got a lot of good topics today. Spent the morning researching them. We're going to talk about Michael Parenti, obviously. Somebody told me in the comments the other day that they hadn't heard Parenti's lectures. I believe they said they had read some of his books, but hadn't heard his lectures. So I was like, oh my goodness, this cannot stand. There should not be anyone in the Midwestern Marks Institute audience who hasn't heard the wonderful lectures of Michael Parenti, true working class legend. Someone who was blackballed from academia and attacked and targeted by the police for his views and for standing up for revolutionary governments and for existing socialism and people in the global South and the working people in his own country for his entire life. So we'll watch some Parenti lectures. I got some parts of his lectures clipped out that I think will be really good for our stream today. We'll also talk about the 50-year anniversary of the CIA-backed coup of Salvador Allende that brought to power the brutal dictator Augusto Pinochet, who would proceed to kill and torture thousands of Chilean socialists. And then we'll also talk about the U.S. decision to send depleted uranium to Ukraine. And we'll talk about the efforts that the U.S. and even the World Health Organization have gone to in order to lie and cover up the effects that the use of depleted uranium in the past has had on public health in Yugoslavia, specifically what's now Kosovo, and Iraq, specifically Baghdad, and I believe the eastern part of Iraq. But we'll get into all of that after our introduction. All right. I did not know that RBN was going live at this time as well. Dang, that is a tough choice. I guess you're just going to have to decide. Would you rather listen to a debate or analysis of the debate between Brianna Joy Gray and Kyle Kulinski, which I actually talked about this morning on TikTok. It was quite a ridiculous debate. Or do you want to talk about Michael Parenti and depleted uranium to Ukraine and the topics that I have? And then you'll have to just watch the VOD later or watch the recap later of whatever stream you choose not to watch. But that is a tough choice. I'm sure I will watch that RBN breakdown of Brianna Joy Gray's debate with Kyle Kulinski. I watched their breakdown of the Jimmy Dore Cornel West thing, and I thought it was really interesting. They had a similar analysis to me, where they were both criticizing Cornel West and saying that Cornel West should listen to the working class part of his base. But then they also criticized Jimmy for, I'm not one to call anybody a class reductionist, but, telling Cornel West that even bringing up and talking about white supremacy and talking about race issues is going to tank his campaign. RBN disagreed with that, and obviously I disagree with that too. But the debate between Brianna Joy Gray and Kyle Kulinski was just ridiculous, man. He was just, really hitting her over the head or trying to steamroll her the way that Kyle always does. I had an ex-girlfriend when I was a social democrat. I would listen to Kyle Kulinski a lot, and she was like, I just don't like Kyle. He just is like arrogant and railroads people and is kind of obnoxious. And now that Kyle's like pushing all these neoliberal talking points, pushing vote blue no matter who, and shaming Cornel West for even running, I kind of see it. I'm like, oh man, he is kind of obnoxious and arrogant. But hey, Jacob, how's it going? Christopher Romero, how are you? Abolished NATO says, Eddie, we need you to begin work on a Mecha Tanky Warrior Wrestling tournament to honor the 2036 CPUSA takeover of the United States and the subsequent integration of the USA into BRICS. Absolutely. That can be my job. I can be the chairman of wrestling. I will take over USA Wrestling on behalf of the CPUSA. And yes, that would be a great event to commemorate our entry into BRICS, you know, to bring the best warriors in terms of hand-to-hand combat together, to have a tournament and really test ourselves and prepare ourselves for the future and for the struggle that is building socialism. I love it. So she was right all along. I know. I'm like, should I get back? Should I call her? Like, she called it about Kyle Kulinski. Like, clearly she knew what she was talking about. But yeah. So shout out to whoever told me the other day that they hadn't heard any of Parenti's lectures before. Of course, that cannot stand. I found this really good one that I like. I always quote this lecture or this segment of a lecture. It's really short. The title of the YouTube video is Michael Parenti, Is Bush a Failure? Obviously in reference to George Bush, who was often portrayed as an idiot, as an imbecile, as somebody who was making the ridiculous policy decisions that he was making by accident. You know, he got us into Iraq not because he was working on behalf of the oil companies to manufacture a war and justification for war, but he fell into the Iraq war because he thought he was doing the right thing, or he was just so stupid. He was such an imbecile. He didn't know what he was doing all along. It was all a big accident. That was kind of how Bush was portrayed by the media, or the media that didn't like him, the Democratic media, as just this dumb guy. And here, Parenti is kind of going to challenge that idea. So without giving it away or saying any more, let's just play it.
TV, the world is thinking.
Bush is...
Sorry to pause it already, but I already like what Sean Moon is saying. Absolutely not a failure. A successful class warrior on behalf of the capitalist class. That's one of the things I say all the time. Class warfare is two-sided, and there are capitalists like the Koch brothers who spent all their money influencing the education system and the higher education system to teach neoliberal Milton Friedman economics, or people like George Bush, or people like Hillary Clinton, who are warriors on behalf of the capitalist class, right? They understand that they need to fight the class struggle in order to maintain their place on top of class society. And so they wage that struggle on behalf of the capitalists as hard as they can, right? Class struggle doesn't just mean working class struggle. That's what we need to organize. That's what we want more of. But the capitalist class is also struggling against us. And some capitalists are more conscious of that than others, and more engaged in suppressing us than others. All right, I'll shut up.
Bush is described as a failed administration, right? We're hearing that all the time. Now, are you going to repeat that phrase because you've heard someone else say it? Or are you going to say, what failure? You're going to repeat my phrase. What failure? You're going to say, what wrong turns? The estate tax has been eliminated. Corporate taxes have been cut back to almost nothing. Billions in Medicare are being handed over to the big pharmaceutical companies. We had no choice on this. Military budget has doubled. Record profits for the defense industry. Record corporate profits. Human services have been cut back or held flat. All the Great Society programs are pretty much gutted and defunded. Wages remain flat or have declined. 2 presidential elections have been stolen. Read the book, it's in there, chapter on that. The super rich are richer than ever? You tell me where the failure is. When George Bush came into office, oil was $20 a barrel. 7 years later, oil is $100 a barrel. Is that a failure or a success?
The only way that you could call George Bush a failure is if you don't know who he's working for. If you don't know what class he is working at the behest of, which is the capitalist class, which makes their money through the exploitation and subsequent suppression of the working class, the working masses, the majority of society. So yeah, his policies may have been a failure for the country as a whole, the majority of people living in this country, but for a specific capitalist class, whom are the people that George Bush serves, he was extremely successful. The only way he wasn't successful is that George Bush was kind of a madman, right? He was like Obama was able to start the wars with Syria and Libya. And, you know, people still think his biggest controversy was when he wore a tan suit. You know, he was able to invade those countries and destroy Libya much more covertly. Whereas Bush was just like, let's invade Afghanistan and Iraq and the war on terror, and we're going to do it. And, you know, hell and fire and fury kind of took the mask off of the empire in a way. But it was still very successful from the perspective of oil oligarchs and weapons contractors.
Well, it depends on what side of the gas pump you're standing, isn't it? For us, it's a failure of an administration. Something's really wrong. For the guys who run the oil companies, it's heaven. It's paradise. Even in the area of foreign policy, there have been setbacks, it's true, but much success. U.S. military power has established a presence in the Middle East and in a place it has almost never been before in its entire history, with major permanent bases in Central Asia, in countries which most Americans don't even know exist and whose names they can't pronounce. Large permanent military bases. Iraq, well, Iraq has been very good to about 100 U.S. corporations in billions of dollars in contracts at a level of profit that's the hottest thing going in the last 4 years. The hottest area of investment has been getting in on the Iraq gravy.
Exactly. Everyone says Iraq was a failure because it was a strategic failure. It destabilized the country. It created these terror groups like ISIS. Everyone says Afghanistan was a failure because we leave and nothing has changed. The Taliban is still in power, and Afghanistan has hardly developed their infrastructure at all. But the ruling class got what they wanted out of these wars, right? The oil companies got off scot-free in the case of Iraq. All of Iraq's oil wealth essentially was handed over to Western multinationals, and it remains that way to this day. So yeah, they toppled Iraq's central government and created a power vacuum where all these different groups, including a lot of jihadist extremist groups, would fight for the power. And that made it so the U.S. had to stay there and occupy the country for years. And many American soldiers died. Millions of Iraqis died. So that's a failure from a human perspective, or from the perspective of any working class person or anyone who was tricked into joining the U.S. military and sent over there to get PTSD. But from the perspective of the oil companies, it was a success. You know, their profits went up. The line went up. That means society good. Thank you so much for the super chat, Leo. Appreciate you, brother. Parenti is definitely a giga Chad. No doubt about that.
1/3 of the Pentagon budget for Iraq is unaccounted for. The Pentagon admits at least 1/3. It may be even more. Again, that's a failure as far as administering for the public interest and the commonweal. But it's a smashing success if you're on the take and you're in there scooping up the gravy. Free trade is going into its final phase and is destroying local markets and production. It's wiping out the entire Mexican peasant class. That's why we're getting so many of these people wanting to come. You think they just so love to freeze their butts off? And the Bay Area and Mexico is a wonderful place.
Imperialism creates immigration. And that's a process that Marx talks a lot about in Capital Volume 1. This is actually Volume 3, but he calls it the enclosure of the commons. When you have capitalism spread to places where there's different kinds of modes of production, like, say, peasant workers who produce a lot of their own means of subsistence, you need to get rid of them in order for capitalism to take hold. Because, for one, capitalism needs that land. The capitalists need the land that the peasants are working. And two, capitalism needs an army of wage labor. So they need to divorce people from the means of production, tools, and from the land. So that people's only option is to sell their labor to a capitalist. That's the only way they can survive. So, that was still taking place, even in modern day in places like Mexico, where capitalism spread and free trade was enforced on them. And it created what Marx would call the enclosure of the commons. The peasants were pushed off their land, forced to immigrate to the United States or sell their wages to a capitalist. And, back when capitalism was first kicking off in Europe, a lot of people starved because they couldn't find any way to produce their means of subsistence anymore, or they couldn't find a capitalist to sell their wages to. And even if they could, they were in absolute destitution during the Industrial Revolution and whatnot. So, and in China, a lot of what they've done, this is part of their poverty alleviation plans, and this is part of their combating capitalism and building a socialist society, is they've given people these plots of land where they can grow their own means of subsistence, where they can grow their own food. So it's, not divorcing these people from the land, not divorcing people from the means of production and the ability to create their own means of subsistence, but actually encouraging them and incentivizing them to grow their own means of subsistence and produce for themselves. So they're less dependent on the market, less dependent on selling their wage labor. That's in a lot of the rural regions of China.
They often have no choice, and it's got the pressure for immigration to go and try and find a living is getting more and more desperate. Free trade is extending corporate control over every corner of the Earth's remaining resources. Free trade elevates the right to property above all other rights that exist, including national sovereignties to defend democratic rights.
That quote at the end reminds me of Domenico Lacerdo's graph that I talk about all the time, where the Western liberal tradition protects private property over all else, individual mastery over private property, which is what is protected by the state. And then they also, claim to protect civil and political rights, although right to private property comes first and is often used as justification to infringe on civil and political rights. Then you have identity politics that grows out of that versus the Hegelian, Marxist, and Chinese tradition. Sovereignty comes first. Democracy comes first. The people's right to determine their own destiny, a nation's right to determine their own future and their own politics and their own economic system. What grows out of that, the next most important part, is right to economic well-being, protecting the material needs or meeting the material needs of the society and the people in it. And then what grows out of that is protection for civil, political, cultural, and environmental rights. So, as Parenti said, in the liberal tradition and with liberal imperialism, individual mastery over private property is often placed above sovereignty. So if a country wants to move towards socialism, if they want to move away from liberalism or neoliberalism, the U.S. will do a regime change effort or put that country under sanctions or invade that country. And take away their sovereignty in order to protect private property. And I couldn't help but think when Parenti said it's working for the oil companies, the system and George Bush is working for the oil companies. He's not a failure for them. He's just a failure for the workers. It reminds me of Kamala Harris saying Bidenomics is working. It is working for the ruling class. It is working for the people who have plundered Ukraine's economy, for BlackRock and Vanguard and shareholders and speculators on Wall Street. It's working for them. It's not working for the working masses. It's not working for the 60% of Americans who have healthcare debt. It's It's not working for the 8 and 10 elderly people with dementia or Alzheimer's who can't pay for memory care. It's not working for the Americans who can't retire. It's not working for the 40,000 people who die every single year because they don't have access to basic health insurance, right? Bidenomics is not working for the masses, but it is working for the ruling class and the shareholders. And Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, that's who they serve. Have you seen or heard of Patrick Stewart as Lenin? Yes. I've seen clips of it on TikTok. Like, it gets posted by Marxists and stuff all the time, but I have not seen the movie. No. Sounds awesome. He's a comrade. That's lit. You can't impersonate Kamala without doing her laugh. Oh, I don't even know. We did it, Joe. I don't know. Fall of Eagles is a Patrick Stewart movie. I haven't seen that. Maybe at some point. All right, one more Parenti clip today. This is him talking about class versus culture. Extremely relevant for today when the ruling class is doing anything that they can to distract us with culture war issues. If you go on any of the major pundits' YouTube channels or their radio shows, the Ben Shapiro's of the world, 90% of what they're talking about is related to the culture war, right? That's how they draw views. That's how they keep a lot of people distracted. So Parenti is going to talk about the relationship of class and culture and the people who try and divorce class and culture and act like they're not interrelated. It's also, he's said in the West, a lot of academics and intellectuals and political pundits do ABC theorizing. ABC meaning anything
now,
but
there's nothing
class.
wrong with
So Carlos and I have quoted that a lot of times. That's one of his quotes in Black Shirts and Reds. And here he's kind of going to go into that and talk about the importance of centering class and the relationship between cultural issues and class issues. Today, we remember our fallen comrades from Chile. Thank you so much, Virtuoso, for the $2 super chat. You bet. Got a whole segment coming up about Comrade Allende and all the socialists and communists in Chile who are still fighting against imperialism and remembering the coup that brought the murderous dictator Augusto Pinochet to power. So we will talk about that later. Thank you so much for the super chat. Parenti, the culture struggle.
not just by class experience.
His microphone is all messed up in this, so I'll try and get it as loud as I can.
Now, there's nothing wrong with treating class, race, gender, and culture and other such things as distinct from each other. In many respects, they are. The mistake is to consider them unconnected, that they're always mutually exclusive, that if this thing has to do with race, then it doesn't have anything to do with class, or if it has to do with gender, then it's a distinct. Now, by the way, there are sometimes.
And this is what I think Cornel West should have said to Jimmy Dore. That struggles against racism and structural racism and institutional racism in, say, the criminal justice system, the prison system, or with the cops and things like that, those are class struggles, right? Those cannot be divorced from class struggles. It's far, far, far more likely for the police to shoot or pull over or arrest a poor person than a rich person, right? There's a huge correlation between lower income status and how likely you are to be arrested or be targeted by a violent cop. And then on top of that, it's even more likely for a black person to get shot if they're poor versus a white person who's poor, right? So struggle against the criminal justice system that preys upon the working masses is both an anti-racist struggle, a struggle against racist power structures, and a class struggle. Right, these things can't be divorced from from each other. They're interrelated, and it's okay and good and correct to point out that the criminal justice system is both racist and classist.
Distinct concerns, life and death concerns, which might at the core have a purely racial or gender fixed problem to them, but much of our race, gender, class, or cultural experience is linked to each other. they're interrelated and may be part of the same overall systemic dynamic. Let's take class, because I do think it's the crucial factor regarding certain issues, not all issues. There are two ways of looking at class. Not class as such is not, and I'll tell you why.
Parenti always does dialectical materialism and Marxist analysis without saying that's what he's doing, right? But one of the principles of dialectics that Carlos is always talking about is that things are interrelated, right? And when you're analyzing something, you can't divorce it from the other things that it's related to. So race issues or cultural issues and class issues are interrelated. You can't divorce them from each other. That's a very dialectical thing to say by Parenti there, but he often does like a dialectical materialist analysis without quoting Marx or without quoting communist thinkers who are going to scare a lot of people in his audience.
But class power is the crucial factor. It's very crucial for anybody who wants to urge people onward in their perceptions and criticisms in this society, because in this society, class and class power are just about almost blotted out. You can show people a whole film about class power and they'll say, oh, I didn't see that. No, oh yeah, oh, now that you mention it. It's amazing how this will happen. That Americans, and I'm talking about American intellectuals, are almost trained not to talk about class.
Isn't it interesting that this was years ago and it's always been that way? They've always done anything but class theorizing. Right, and it's the exact thing they do today with just the hyper focus on id pol, hyper focus on identity politics and hyper focus on racial issues or cultural issues, and just no talk about class ever. Because, that serves the ruling class's interests. Right? It serves the ruling economic class's interest for us to not focus on economic class and the effects that it has on society, and just focus all of our attention on culture war issues. And that's always served the ruling class. That's why ABC, anything but class theorizing, has been something that Parenti's been talking about for 30, 40 years.
So I want to talk about class because I still haven't been housebroken on this issue. There's two ways of looking at class. You can look at it as a demographic trait relating to lifestyle, income, status, upper middle, upper, lower class, that sort of thing. There's another way of looking at class. That's not just a demographic terminology. And that is looking at class as a relationship having to do with political economic power. And it's an interrelationship. So there's no such thing as a class, except in relationship to another class. So you can't have lords of the manor unless you have serfs. You can't have slaveholders unless you have slaves, to take the earliest of class societies. You can't have owners and bosses unless you have workers. That they define each other in a relationship. And you can't have equality of different classes.
Again, the dialectics, the looking at classes as interpenetrating opposites in society. In slave society and capitalist society, that's dialectical materialism.
You can hope for equality of gender. I'm not saying we have it, but you can conceptualize a society in which men and women could be equal, and we're struggling for that. You can conceptualize a society where people of different ethnic groups, African American, Latino, Euro-American, all the various ethnic groups, Euro-American, Asian American. So you can conceptualize a society where all those people could live in equality and peace and mutual respect. And again, I'm not saying we've achieved that, but we're struggling for those things. But you can't do that with class. By definition, you can't say we'll have a class, we'll have a society where the rich capitalists and the workers are equal together, which is what they tell us we do have already. You see, that's what they say. Oh, we're all just regular old Americans. You, me, Rupert Murdoch, David Rockefeller, Bill Gates, and all that. Because, you see, and the interrelationship in classes, not only do they define each other, but the interrelation, it's an inherently unequal relationship by definition. And the inequality comes from its relationship to a third set of factors. To a third factor, I mean, and that is the means of production. The mines, the factories, the railroads, the media, the this, the that, the companies, the corporations. What's the relationship to the wealth of the nation? To who controls the wealth of the nation? One group owns all those means of production, distribution, and accumulation of capital. And the other group has only one thing to sell in that market where so many things are being sold, and that's their human labor. I got to get a job, that's called.
The richest society in history is also the most unequal. Coincidence? Absolutely not, because the accumulation of wealth in capitalism means the accumulation of poverty and suffering and degradation and exploitation on the other side. Wealth for capitalists equals suffering and exploitation for the workers. That's how the system works. So there can be no class collaboration, as Parenti said, because the wealth of the capitalist, the accumulating capital of the capitalist, is stems from the exploitation of the working mass. And the less they pay you, the less benefits they pay you, the less cost of production they have, and the more money they make, the more they can accumulate. So it's baked into the system, the incentive for them to suppress your wages and get you to work as intensely as possible for as many hours as possible. Play just a little more.
It has nothing but its labor, and it gets back much less than it produces. But again, by definition. As a boss, there's only one reason I'm going to hire you. It's so that I can make money off your labor. And the way I make money off your labor is by paying you less than the value you produce for me. I mean, unless you're the boss's son-in-law or something, and you're a nitwit and he can't get a job anywhere else, you bring him in, give him a little sinecure job. But normally, the only way I'm going to hire you is because I can make money off your labor. So I remember doing strike support work for United Auto Workers in Carbondale, Illinois, in an earlier lifetime.
So yeah, pretty interesting. Because we all recognize that class is what's most important. Class is what's at the center of our society. And exploitation of the working class, which creates surplus value for the ruling class, is both what gives them their status as the ruling class, what allows them to accumulate wealth, riches, and power, and gives them their power over us. And it's also what motivates them. It's what incentivizes the ruling class, producing as much profit, producing as much surplus value as possible. And again, in doing that, it means they're going to suppress the working masses, because that's how they create their wealth. That's how they create surplus value. It's through our exploitation. And then if we rise up against them, if we rise up against the exploitation, we get organized against it, it's in their interest to suppress us and break up our organizations and brainwash us with propaganda about, or anti-union propaganda and anti-communist propaganda. And it's class that creates that. And, racism or, wokeism and the hyper focus on identity politics and culture war issues, those are tools of class power, right? Racism is a tool that the slave owners used to justify enslaving black people so that they could use them to create surplus value, and so that they could prevent the white workers and the black slaves from teaming up against the ruling economic class, the slave owners. Racism was a tool used to divide white and black workers prior to the civil rights movement, right? These things are tools of the ruling economic class, but they're not what drives society. Humans aren't inherently racist. There's no inherent division between black and white people. It's a division, a schism that's injected into society by the ruling class so we don't come together and struggle collectively, right? The divisions between classes, the schism between people who own the means of production and people who don't, that is a schism that's inherent to capitalist society, right? It's a division that can be overcome through moving towards socialism and collective ownership of the means of production. But that's a real material difference. Is the video skipping for anyone else? Oh, hopefully it wasn't. Exactly, Eddie. That's why Wall Street banks and other Fortune 500 companies promote all that culture war stuff. Right. That's why, like, Raytheon and Boeing and all these countries, when it's Pride Month, they put out rainbow flags. You know, they just want a virtue signal and say, we care about cultural issues. So don't focus on class issues. Don't focus on the fact that these weapons manufacturers and these companies who produce weapons of war are some of the richest people in the country, while thousands are homeless and, you know, thousands are dying because they don't have access to health care. The people who make bazookas and Apache helicopters are sitting on mountains and mountains of wealth. And they don't want you to question that. They don't want you to question your class position and why they have so much power and control over the government. So they say, look how progressive we are on these culture war issues. Look how progressive we are when it comes to bathrooms. Or look at the BLM stickers and the pride flags we slapped on the Apache helicopters. We're so progressive. I'm about to upgrade some Chomsky books to Parenti books. Nice. Great decision. Manufacturing Consent is a great book. Inventing Reality is an even better book. But they would never fly those flags in the 80s during the AIDS pandemic when people actually needed their help. No, right. They'd never spend money on actually helping people. They'll only spend money on their LGBTQ marketing budget. They won't actually help LGBTQ working people better their own material conditions. What up, Yellow Like Parenti? You missed it. We were just watching your lectures. Good to have you here. The real Michael Parenti, everybody. It's really him. He's here. Hillary and some libs do fake stuff around BLM. Besides that, I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, almost all the libs do. Remember when they were kneeling in kente cloth? But what I was referring to was the fact that all the major weapons manufacturers were sponsoring Pride this year and sent representatives to Pride. That's a real thing. And when it's Pride Month, and I think we've all seen this, all these companies roll out rainbow logos. So they splash rainbows on their logo. And that's, you know, even the weapons manufacturers, even the military industrial complex has begun doing this. So Max Blumenthal actually went to a Raytheon meeting the other day where their shareholders were discussing stuff. And they talked about how they need to stand up for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right? This is a company that's making money off of the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war and is making drones for the U.S. to launch at wedding parties in Africa and surveil the entire continent of Africa. And they're talking about how they support diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're sending people to Pride. This is them saying, don't focus on the class issue. Don't focus on the fact that us, the weapons manufacturers, are some of the richest people in capitalist society and we're profiting heavily off war and death and destruction. Don't ask that question, the class question. Just focus on how progressive we are in terms of diversity. And look at the executive that we sent to Pride and look at our rainbow logo. It's pretty... That's clearly different from your argument of saying that big bad liberals support diversity. And who actually cares about all that? Apparently they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend thousands of dollars in their marketing budget off of to market themselves as a woke, diverse company. Why are you so... I don't understand where the anger comes from with you, Reclaimed. And it kind of just seems like... I don't know. You're a liberal. I got nothing else to say. And I mean, that's not just something that's that only the weapons manufacturers are doing. Not even close. It's something that almost all the Democratic politicians are doing. Listen to any of their campaigns, dude. Listen to any Democrat's campaign. Maybe they'll talk about healthcare a little bit, but, you know, a rational politician in this country, 90% of their rhetoric would be focused on ending the wars, you know, reinvesting in America, bringing jobs back, moving towards Medicare for all, similar to how Bernie Sanders campaigned. You know, he was one of the only rational sounding candidates for working class people. But what do these Democrats talk about, right? They talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, culture war issues, because they don't want you to ask the class question. They don't want you to ask, you know, what are you going to do on behalf of the working class? What are you going to do to fight for Medicare for all, right? They just want to say, you know, I'm going to focus on these cultural issues, which is where we're different than the Republicans. And look at how bad and evil and terrible the Republicans are. Meanwhile, on class issues, they have the same position, right? So they keep us fighting over these cultural issues. They keep us polarized with the culture war stuff. Meanwhile, the rich who control both parties are running out the back door with all the money. It's really not that hard to understand, unless you're in high school. And even I feel like a lot of high schoolers should be able to understand this too. Even Bernie and Cornell doing that. True. Yeah. They want you fighting with your neighbors. Exactly. Maybe I'll react to that, Jacob. Maybe. Thank you for sending it. I figured this out in middle school. I mean, it's not a difficult concept to understand when they're literally saying that we need to support regime change in Iran for women's rights. Not to say that, you know, women's rights are amazing in Iran or whatever, but that's literally them using a culture-based issue to try and justify a regime change effort, an act of imperialism. But let's talk about the Pinochet coup, because recently it was the 50-year anniversary of the CIA putting Augusto Pinochet in power, ousting the democratically elected Salvador Allende. And Fidel warned Allende, he said, watch out, now that you've been elected, the USA is going to come after you, so you need to take steps to protect yourself, to arm yourself. Unfortunately, the steps that Allende took to protect himself were not enough, and the U.S. started working with the most extremist elements in Chilean society and in the Chilean military. They stormed the presidential palace of Allende and launched rockets at it. And Allende committed suicide before he could be captured and tortured. Pinochet promptly massacred and tortured thousands of people in Chile's national soccer stadium. Throughout his reign, he would massacre and disappear and torture over 40,000 people with the help of the CIA, who were giving him kill lists or giving him lists of leftists and socialists so that he could target them. And they were giving him the torture techniques that they had developed in Project MKUltra. And what Operation Condor was basically a CIA project to outsource all the torture techniques that they developed in MKUltra to Latin America and teach all these US-backed dictators and military juntas to use the torture techniques that the CIA had developed. We also recently found out that the UK was complicit in the coup and that they gave in 1970 gave support to the Pinochet government while celebrating the fact that British business interests were going to make a lot more money with Pinochet behind the scenes. They were excited that the nationalization of major industries that happened under Allende would come to an end, and British multinational capitalists would have a chance to exploit Chile's resources. So here's a TikTok I did about it, and we can watch that first. In 1973, the CIA helped the Chilean military organize a bloody coup against the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. This put in power Augusto Pinochet, who quickly massacred up to 2,000 people in the Chilean national soccer stadium. And during his time in power, he would kill or torture over 40,000 people in total. Now, leaked documents have just been released showing that the British government was supportive of Pinochet and actually aided his government. The documents show that the British government was well aware aware that Pinochet had banned trade unions as well as opposition parties, and he was massacring his political enemies. But the UK chose to ignore that and said that most British businessmen will be overjoyed that they now have access to Chile's resources, especially Shell Oil Company. The British gave aid and credit to the Pinochet government while actively covering up their crimes against humanity, and British business interests were able to pillage a lot of Chile's resources that Salvador Allende had previously nationalized. And this is how capitalist imperialism works. The UK and US governments work at the behest of giant corporations and economic interests, finance capitalists and big banks, and any leader in the global south who tries to nationalize their resources and reinvest them in development is going to be targeted by the US and UK governments. And the bloody coup against the democratically elected Allende is still one of the premier examples of this. So there you go. That's the history of British involvement and some of the history of the coup. There's a lot more that Pinochet. We could talk about the economic effects, because libertarians like to call what happened in Chile, or right-wingers like to call what happened in Chile, an economic miracle, because the profits of multinationals shot through the roof as soon as they were allowed to exploit Chile's resources. But almost all of the measures of human well-being went down. You know, malnutrition went up, poverty went up, homelessness went up. There was like milk programs and programs to feed students that were gotten rid of. The education rates went down. So, you know, all these things that measure actual human development went down while corporate profits went up. And then Milton Friedman and his buddies who were advising Augusto Pinochet said, oh, look, it's an economic miracle. The line went up. That means society got better. And it's funny, too, that those people claim to support small government. These libertarians claim to support small government, and then they're backing the Pinochet regime. There was our old friend Prax Ben, the idiot who wore sunglasses inside during our debate when I destroyed him and when he embarrassed himself and said that Thomas Edison was one of the founding fathers of America. He was giving tacit support for the Pinochet regime and saying that the coup was a good thing, and saying that he was happy that Allende killed himself and that all socialists should go kill themselves like Allende, blah, 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 blah. Like, dude, you claim to support small government. You told me in this debate that you support anarcho-capitalism where there's no government at all. So how can you support the government that tortures and murders people in the National Soccer Stadium and tortures people for their political ideology? Or how can you support the CIA, the U.S. government institution that brought this to power, that overthrew the democratic will of the people in order to put in power this dictatorial terrorist government? And then you call yourself an anarchist or say that you're against the government. You're a fool, right? But that's what libertarians have said forever. They've always supported Pinochet while claiming to support small government. But anyways, Pinochet was good buddies with Margaret Thatcher as well, which, you know, kind of gives away that the UK tacitly supported him, because Thatcher openly supported him. She would invite him to like have tea and stuff like that. But anyways, recently, socialists, communists, and activists in Chile hit the streets to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the coup and commemorate the people who became victim to the CIA-backed terrorist regime and were victimized by Pinochet. But a bunch of Pinochet supporters wielding Molotov cocktails and other things went and confronted the socialist and communist demonstrators in public, and the protests eventually erupted into violence. Also, the social democratic, self-described leftist regime of Gabriel Boric, who has condemned Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba as dictatorships, was found gassing protesters at Allende's grave. So pretty ironic there. And I did another TikTok about this. So we'll watch this and then talk more. Recently, it was the 50-year anniversary of the CIA-backed coup in Chile that ousted Salvador Allende and put Augusto Pinochet in power. And there were demonstrations held in the streets to commemorate those who were killed by Pinochet's regime. However, the demonstrations were marred by violence, and Al Jazeera reported that there were communists and socialists marching peacefully, while supporters of Pinochet were carrying rocks and Molotov cocktails trying to incite violence. the kind of extremists that the US likes to give money and guns to if a country starts to move in a socialist direction. Also, Chilean government forces were recorded tear gassing protesters. I didn't even mention in the video, this was at Allende's grave. They were showing their respects or paying their respects to Allende's grave. And the Chilean military forces came and tear gassed them. By the way, Pinochet and his fascistic forces backed by the CIA were a section of the Chilean military. Which is why it's really difficult during a socialist revolution to transform the state apparatus and create new people's militias or new armed bodies of the state, because you have all these leftover parts of the military from the last society. Especially if you're trying to do things democratically and, you know, through voting like Allende, and you're not having this, you know, revolutionary upsurge where you can just suppress certain elements of the military that are reactionary and that are backed by the CIA. And the person who posted that said NATO-aligned woke president of Chile tear gasses people paying respects at Allende's grave. And that's in reference to the social democratic president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, who's taken some extremely questionable foreign policy positions and condemned countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba as dictatorships. So it's ironic that he's now using tear gas on his own people peacefully protesting. Solidarity with these communists and socialists organizing these awesome demonstrations. As dictatorships. Isn't that crazy about Boric? And I mean, we supported Boric in his election because he was better than whatever right-wing candidate he was running against. All right, but he has really not been great. He's been a very typical social democrat or a very typical self-described leftist, or, you know, woke leftist, as that account said. Because he's condemned Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba as being dictatorships. They're dictatorships. They're not countries combating imperialism who have massively increased literacy and healthcare access in their countries as they try and build socialism while being targeted by what Vijay Prashad would call hybrid warfare from the United States, sanction regimes, combined with propaganda efforts, combined with funneling money into the political opposition. Right? It's those, that's not what they are. They're authoritarian dictatorships. They're evil. Boric just buys right into the US State Department propaganda, gobbles it up and regurgitates it for his people. And then he's tear gassing his people who are paying their respects to Salvador Allende at his grave. That seems kind of authoritarian, Gabriel. How can you condemn Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua as dictatorships when you're tear gassing your own people? Are you an authoritarian dictator? It seems like you're running an authoritarian dictatorship. Should NATO intervene? Should NATO or should the U.S. financial system, U.S.-backed and dominated financial system, put sanctions on your country? Should the IMF and World Bank prevent other countries from trading with you and try and starve out your people because of this authoritarianism? Because that's what you're advocating for in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So very, very ironic there. But again, solidarity with those protesters, commemorating the coup, you know, and publicly Boric did say solidarity with the protesters and whatnot, and we'll never forget the coup. But yeah, he certainly hasn't been in Allende. He hasn't been nationalizing Chile's resources and trying to move towards socialism. He's been saying, well, let's move beyond capitalism maybe sometime eventually in the future. By the way, I like NATO, but for right now, I'm just gonna side with NATO. I'm not a huge fan of Boric. If you can't tell, I'm a communist. He's not. Also, the coup in Chile was orchestrated by Henry Kissinger, who's still alive, still walking around, still living a life of luxury, still praised as like a hero or like some kind of good guy for this country when he is a mass murderer. Someone who committed literal genocide in Cambodia, saying if it moves, hit it, or something like that. Basically, if it moves, drop a bomb on it. Anthony Bourdain famously said, once you go and visit Cambodia and talk to the people there, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands. That's a real quote from Bourdain. And he also orchestrated the Pinochet coup in Chile that got thousands killed. So one of our favorite academics, Vijay Prashad, made a message to Henry Kissinger from Santiago, Chile this morning. And I added my own little message for Kissinger onto it. So, Vijay Prashad's style is a little bit more laid back than mine. You might be able to tell in this video, but yeah, here's our message for Kissinger.
Good morning, Henry Kissinger. It's 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of September in Santiago, Chile. 50 years ago, you green-lighted a coup which almost destroyed this country. The people fought back. They're still fighting back. Your memory, what you did to this country, will never be forgotten.
Yeah, and I'm gonna beat your ass. Where you at, Henry? You're real tough when you're dropping bombs on the people of Vietnam. Not real tough when you get in the cage, you big sack of crap.
So yeah, my style's a little bit different than DJ's. He laid out a nice message to Henry Kissinger. And I just said, I'll beat your ass, Henry Kissinger. I would too if I got the chance. I don't care that he's 104 years old. And I'd probably kick him once in his gut and he would disintegrate into dust. Don't even care. He deserves it. He disintegrated a lot of people in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam to dust. Just for resources, just on behest of the military-industrial complex. Again, one of those politicians who could only be viewed as a failure from the perspective of the working class, from the perspective of the majority, but from the perspective of the ruling economic class, from the capitalists, from the exploiters, Henry Kissinger was a great success. And I'll beat his ass. He did that Palestinian episode at a time when it was really controversial to be anti-Zionist. Not that it's much better now, but still. Yeah, it's kind of crazy to watch what happened to Roger Waters and watch how even how RFK immediately turned on him, how everyone immediately attacked him for standing up for Palestine. But yeah, it's cool that Bourdain did a pro-Palestinian episode back in the day. When I'm sure he was called anti-Semitic for that. The heck else was I gonna say? I was gonna say something else, but yeah. I wish everyone could be so brave and stand up for Palestine. Cough, cough, RFK. Cough, cough. Despite the subject matter, the stream is lifting my droopy spirits. Living in the belly of the beast can be soul-crushing sometimes. Thanks for the ray of sunshine, Eddie. Bet we got to stick together, comrades. No worries. That's what I'm here for. I'm glad I could lift your spirits. And, I know it can seem hard living in the belly of the beast sometimes. And obviously our economic conditions are poop and are getting poopier. So I understand, that's always going to be a struggle for most people, but you got to find joy where you can find it. And, there's so much reason to have hope and optimism for the future. Socialism is now more popular than capitalism among young people, right? The country's moving in the right direction. The labor movement is rising up. It's coming back to life all across this country. There's all sorts of collective bargaining and collective organizing going on. The working class is, recognizing itself as a class once again, starting to see itself as a class. The international movement for socialism is moving in the right direction. China's abolished poverty. We're moving towards multipolarity, and all these countries are striking out against the U.S. and forging closer trade deals with China. The socialist Chinese economy is the fastest growing economy on earth. Right? There's all these reasons to be positive about the future. We just have to organize it. We need to sharpen our tools for class struggle. We need to point out the liars and the radical recuperators, the Vauches and the Slavoj Žižeks of the world who call themselves Marxists, call themselves revolutionaries, but then push people towards liberalism and imperialism, side with the imperialists every time. We need to illustrate for people who's telling the truth, who's actually about class struggle, and who's deceiving you. And we do that through educating people about theory and giving them the tools that they need to understand the world. And if we do that, the future is bright. We're moving in the right direction. So, and by the way, Zizek published an article recently. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was an article about Africa and all the anti-colonial movements that are going on in Africa. And Gabriel Rockhill tweeted this. Let's find it together. The Eurocentric court jester of imperialism strikes again. Oh, let me zoom in. Hashtag Zizek on hashtag Africa. It is clear that the anti-colonial uprisings in Central Africa are even worse than French neo-colonialism. The anti-colonial uprisings, the people rising up and demanding that the French military occupiers and the foreign multinationals get out of their country and stop exploiting them, are even worse than French neo-colonialism. Interesting, Zizek. Interesting. And for who? Who's it worse for? It's not worse for the people in these countries rising up against colonialism. Who's it bad for? It's bad for the French neo-colonialists. It's bad for the imperialists, which ultimately is who Zizek represents while pretending to be a Marxist, flexing as a Marxist. And please go retweet this from Gabriel Rockhill, because it's important that people see this. There's so many people who have been fooled by Zizek and his culture. You know, they watch like his movie reviews and then they think he's a genius and a Marxist revolutionary and they trust him on everything. When he takes these constantly, when it comes to practical politics, when it comes to real political positions, he sides with the ruling class. He sides with the imperialists every time. Same as a guy like Vaush. And Vaush loves Zizek, loves him. And if you don't know, Gabriel Rockhill wrote this amazing article that we republished on Midwestern Marx called Capitalism's Court Jester, Slavoj Zizek, which was amazing. We also did an interview with Gabriel Rockhill, which you can find on the Midwestern Marx YouTube, where he talks about Zizek's history, how every time he has supported counter-revolutionary forces and imperialist forces rather than revolutionary pro-working class socialist forces. And this is yet another example. And Rockhill gets attacked a lot for pointing these things out about Zizek, these obviously true things. So if you have any kind of Twitter or any X account, please go boost this, like and or retweet it, and then read Rockhill's article about Zizek being capitalism's court jester. He's right. He's 100% right. He's correct. Zizek is just an older version of Vaush, to be honest with you. That's all he is. Doing crunches right now, and every one I think of Zizek's turn Tim and wonder how many he can do. Zizek can do... Zizek, I know people, there are actually quite a few people who can't do a push-up, which is kind of crazy to me, but Zizek might be one of those guys who can't do a sit-up. He's like, you could throw up. Tum-tum. Oh, okay, I got you. Think about Zizek's tum-tum. No, he definitely can't do a sit-up. Stop infantilizing the workers of Africa like they are worse than colonial leeches, Zizek. Exactly. Exactly. Like the people of Africa have no idea what they're doing. He doesn't support their sovereignty. Again, and this is why I say he's a liberal, essentially. Here's the Lacerdo diagram. Anti-colonial sovereignty is what the people of Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa are asserting right now. They're saying, get out of your French occupiers, get out of your neo-colonial forces. We want to determine our own destiny, and we want to develop economic well-being for our people and security for our people. And Zizek is siding with the French colonialists who are saying, no, we need to protect private property. We need to protect the interests of Western multinationals in France, so you can't kick us out. So he's siding with private property over anti-colonial sovereignty. He's siding with liberalism, neoliberalism, capitalism, and imperialism over socialism and the Marxist perspective. He's not a Marxist. He can call himself one as much as he wants. You see that PSL announced some candidates? Yeah, we got to cover that. Oops. We got to cover that on next time Carlos, Noah, and I, or at least two of us, are on stream. I don't want to cover that one alone, but we'll definitely tackle it together because it'll be a good thing to have a conversation about. Vouch, OMG, I effing love him. When Zizek was talking about the NATO bombing campaign on Yugoslavia, that disgusting response is stuck in my head that you guys showed here. Yes, dude, me too. That's why I knew exactly what you were talking about. Like, oh my God, I love him. When Zizek's like, there are leftists condemning NATO carpet bombing Serbia, and they are very wrong. Here's why you should support capitalist imperialism and bombing civilians and infrastructure as a socialist. Ridiculous. What was I saw something I wanted to react to, but I can't remember it. He was pathetic on debate with another loser, Peterson. Yeah, everyone was like, Peterson got destroyed, and he did. But Zizek wasn't like a real Marxist in that debate. That's why Peterson was like, you're a very interesting Marxist to debate with, because he's basically a liberal, just like Peterson. So he wouldn't actually defend any Marxist positions. When are you going to have them on, Eddie? Who? Zizek? Hopefully never. Actually, that would mean a lot of views. I'll debate Zizek. I didn't know much about him when I watched the intro to that debate, but it was very weird how they buddied up for a second like that. Definitely. Claudia and Karina, PSL. Oh, yeah. I'll definitely have them on to interview him. Definitely. I just got to reach out. We got plenty of PSL connects, though, so that will not be hard. Okay, I got to pull something up here. Now, I'm all for anybody spreading socialist ideas or using bourgeois politics to spread socialist ideas. And actually, the commercial that Claudia and Karina put out was really based and really like well made and well produced. So and they're saying things that are different than what the Cornel West campaign is saying. They're from a more Marxist-Leninist, traditional Marxist-Leninist perspective, and saying things that Cornel West is probably afraid to say. So I think it might actually complement the West campaign. But I'd love to see a show with Midwestern Marx and Do Dissidents. Oh, yeah, I've followed them a bit. I don't know what their positions are on a lot of stuff, but it'd be cool. Abolish the CIA, definitely. Leftist politicians need to start comparing themselves to AMLO because he's catching W's every day. AMLO is moving in a good direction, an anti-imperialist and socialist direction for sure. No, I did 42 push-ups and no leg lifts. I don't have a bench here, and I got to save my leg energy for my ride in a minute. That's true. Sometimes you get so leg day hits so hard you like can't drive home. I've been there. But anyways, our last segment for today, the U.S. is sending depleted uranium to Ukraine, DU, which is basically just like uranium waste. I watched a bunch of scientific dissections of depleted uranium and what depleted uranium is. Yeah, it's basically waste used from creating or from enriching uranium, I believe. And the U.S. is sending it to Ukraine to use as a weapon, to use as ammunition. And we'll watch a video on that in a sec. But the U.S. is the only country ever who has used depleted uranium as a weapon of war, who has fired depleted uranium at an enemy. And there have been lots of studies that have come out about the effects of depleted uranium, where the U.S. used them, both in Yugoslavia, in that intervention, NATO-led intervention we were just talking about, that Slavoj Žižek and Vauš both wholeheartedly supported. There have been huge increases in birth defects and rates of cancer that the World Health Organization and that the U.S. State Department have done everything they could to cover up. And similar things have happened in Iraq. So all this is going to lead to now is, highly increased rates of cancer and birth defects and all these terrible things in Ukraine, especially, and with the Russian soldiers who are there fighting Ukraine. So more destruction for the people of Ukraine, more destruction for the infrastructure in the country of Ukraine, more death for both sides in this intervention, all sponsored by the United States and your tax dollars. So here's what they're now sending. Recently, it was announced that the U.S. is sending cluster bombs, but now they've really outdone themselves. No music on this? Okay. The U.S. has announced it will send depleted uranium anti-tank rounds to Ukraine to help drive out Russian forces with the counteroffensive that's already failed. Russia has warned falsely that munitions contain nuclear components. That's literally what it is. Dude, it's literally nuclear waste. That's what depleted uranium is, you liars. Russia has falsely claimed. Experts say that these munitions have advantages, but they should not be considered nuclear weapons. Who cares what they're classified as? They give people cancer. The uranium particles sit around in the air after they're used. People breathe them in, and then when they give birth to a baby, they have horrific birth defects. I don't even want to show you guys the image of the kind of birth defects that babies are getting in Iraq, especially in the regions where depleted uranium was used.
Depleted uranium rounds for tanks that the U.S. agreed to supply Ukraine are munitions for tanks, basically, but the difference is that the material that is used to harden these shells, the tips of them, are made of depleted uranium. And the reason countries started...
They're literally tipped with poison. It's bullets tipped with poison that gives you cancer.
...to use depleted uranium for these munitions is basically because the metal, the uranium, depleted uranium metal is very hard, and it penetrates the conventional armor better than regular munitions. However, uranium as a nuclear material has some radioactivity, but the word depleted uranium means that the uranium used in it has even lower content of uranium than natural uranium. To me, it's just another piece of metal in the arsenal. If you think about it,
it's just another piece of metal in the arsenal. This one causes cancer and horrific birth defects, but it's just another piece of metal. And plus, it's not technically nuclear, and it's not enriched uranium, right? It's waste that comes out when you do enrich uranium, so it's not that bad. I've looked into the science of this depleted uranium, and the explanation she just gave for why it's not dangerous and why it's not bad is so absurd, right? It's depleted uranium, so it's not 100% uranium. It doesn't matter, dude. It still causes cancer and still causes birth defects. Yeah, it's basically a waste product that's created when you're enriching uranium. That doesn't make it better. It wouldn't be worse if we took the enriched uranium and shot that at people and it gave them cancer. It's the same thing. Like, what a ridiculous explanation. But anyways, that's what we're sending to Ukraine. And recently, we're not going to watch all of this, but you can check this out if you want. There was a systematic review conducted about higher rates of cancer and higher rates of birth defects at the places where the U.S. used depleted uranium in Iraq. And the studies overwhelmingly said that there is, a correlation between the use of depleted uranium and an increase in birth defects. But the World Health Organization and the U.S. State Department have put a bunch of measures in place that make it hard for this person to release her research, right? Or make it hard for her to come to conclusions about this that can be published and that can be widely dispersed in medical journals. Instead, this kind of information is being covered up. And, there's been a lot of research done into the steps that the World Health Organization has gone to cover this up. to say, no, 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 the use of depleted uranium didn't cause any birth defects. Ignore all the children who are being born in Iraq with, enormously enlarged heads that are now being called jellyfish babies. There's a name for it in Iraq where this has happened so many times. I mean, some of the birth defects are truly horrific and nothing like what you see in an American hospital, in a hospital where depleted uranium hasn't been used. So that systematic review showed, almost undeniable evidence that there are huge increased rates of cancer and, adverse health effects, which, the Iraqi public health was destroyed by the Gulf War bombings and the subsequent sanctions. The U.S. bombed Iraq's infrastructure and put them in a pre-industrial, near-apocalyptic state. That's how the New York Times described it. And then proceeded to put them under stringent economic sanctions that starved their people and caused 500,000 civilians to starve to death. And they also fired depleted uranium at the Iraqi people, and the U.S. Department of Defense and World Health Organization have gone to enormous lengths to cover that up, to cover up the research about what happened to Iraqi public health and the Iraqi healthcare system as a result of U.S. interventionism. So here's some news reports about depleted uranium in Iraq. Warning, viewer discretion is advised on this one. There are some gruesome pictures of babies affected by this depleted uranium, but I think this is important to see, right? Because understand this is what we're sending to Ukraine right now. The chemical that caused this and all these horrific birth defects here that you're about to see is what we just shipped off to Ukraine to fight for peace and democracy.
Well, tonight's late news special report is about an Australian woman who has spent the past 2 days walking the corridors of power to educate politicians in Canberra about what she believes are the horrific effects of exposure to depleted uranium. The US military has been using the chemical since the Gulf War. The international community will soon vote at the United Nations, urging more transparency on the use of depleted uranium weapons. Australia plans to abstain on that vote, but Donna Mulhern wants to change all that. In a moment, I'll be speaking to her, but first, Leah Craven has her story. And a warning, there are some distressing images in this report.
Is this the toxic legacy of the Iraq War? Parents bury their fourth child. 2 were stillborn, 2 died soon after birth. This is life in the city of Fallujah, where doctors report an unprecedented surge in birth defects. They blame a chemical used by the US military, depleted uranium.
So there is contamination.
One round.
And this is what I was trying to say earlier. There have been measures put in place to where that researcher who conducted the systematic review and these news reports aren't allowed to come to any hard conclusions, right? And say 100% we know that depleted uranium affected birth defects in Iraq. And what they always say is, oh, those studies are biased. Those studies are conducted by Iraqi doctors who see babies with birth defects every day. So they're biased, so we can't trust them. Bullshit. I trust the Iraqi doctors a lot more than I trust the U.S. Department of Defense and the World Health Organization.
One round of depleted uranium can pierce a tank's thick armour, leaving only a burned-out shell. Australian peace activist Donna Mulhern was in Iraq when the war began as a human shield. On 3 subsequent trips, she has documented the increase in infant mortality, congenital birth defects, leukemia and cancer.
Today we have a little baby girl who...
That was... Sorry,
birth defects, leukemia.
This is what they call jellyfish babies, and a lot of these babies born in these areas where the U.S. used depleted uranium on their enemies are born with super enlarged heads like this. And as you can imagine, that also causes a lot of problems for the mother.
Leukemia and cancer.
Today we have a little baby girl who was born just 1 hour ago, and she has birth defects connected with her spine, neuro defects. She also has an enlarged skull.
Helpless parents camp out in hospital.
Yeah, this is how it works. Thank you, Sean Moon. This is explained in that video of the systematic review, which I recommend everyone watch. It's a technical speech, but it's pretty entertaining and actually pretty short. But aerosolized depleted uranium gets into the lungs. You have people breathe it in. When depleted uranium ammo makes contact, it becomes aerosolized. So entire regions are contaminated for generations. Right. So that lady on AP News who was saying they're only tipped with uranium, or it's not that big of a deal, it's only depleted uranium, not real uranium, all nonsense, all bullshit. when those uranium-tipped bullets hit something, the uranium goes into the air and people breathe it in. And that's how we get these birth defects and cancer rates that the U.S. is in denial about. I mean, imagine being such a propagandist for empire that you're willing to go on AP News and lie, knowingly lie, and distort the reality of depleted uranium ammunition so that you can justify using this chemical that's going to give people cancer.
Of a woman watching her baby die.
Most of the photos Donna took of babies in Fallujah City Hospital are too shocking to broadcast. But for paediatrician Dr. Samira Alani, it's her daily reality.
I have recorded 30 cases. In 1 month? In 1 month.
The US military acknowledges that it has used depleted uranium in Iraq. This statement from 2003 boasts that a depleted uranium round had penetrated directly through a sand dune to demolish a tank hiding behind it. At the same time, a US defense health official said, there is no substantial evidence to suggest that depleted uranium is the source of any particular illness from the Gulf.
False. False. Wrong. Lies. There is substantial evidence. The World Health Organization has prevented anyone from coming to hard conclusions. And then when people do come to any conclusions or say it's highly, 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 highly likely that the places where depleted uranium has been used, there's an increase in adverse health effects. That's what every study is showing us. You know, that gets ignored by the media. That gets ignored by the World Health Organization. It doesn't get blasted over a loudspeaker because they want to cover it up.
Australia's Foreign Minister Bob Carr says the government pays close attention to studies, but points out there aren't definitive links between health effects and exposure to the chemical.
If there's no link, what caused this? The difference between the figures before 2004 and after have changed dramatically.
Donna's on the warpath to increase awareness and hopes her personal experience will make an impact. She's lobbying the Australian government to vote for greater transparency about the use of depleted uranium at the United Nations later this month.
Yeah, what do they think? It's just a coincidence? No, there's no statistical correlation there. Sure, adverse health effects and birth defects and cancer rates skyrocketed, specifically in the places where we use depleted uranium, but there's no correlation. The other thing that the government does is they try and hide the places where they use depleted uranium. They don't want that to be public knowledge because then researchers, if they were given access to that data, they could actually look, you know, and draw more statistical correlations for more places. Oh, depleted uranium was used here. Let's look at the health records. Let's find a correlation or not. Right? But if you just hide all the places where you've used depleted uranium and don't tell people, well, then researchers can't draw a correlation. And people can't say, what the hell? Why are you shooting people with depleted uranium? It's hard to even think about the amount of people that American imperialism has killed. Like, we already know that they've killed millions and millions of people, but how many people have they killed and then covered it up and then lied about it? A lot more, including everybody who's died of cancer or every baby who's died of a birth defect because of depleted uranium that the U.S. fired and then lied about. So here's a report from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China about the use of depleted uranium in Yugoslavia, or what's now Kosovo. That's created what they have a name for called Kosovo syndrome. And again, like, the depleted uranium that's going to be used is going to be used in Ukraine, right? The war is taking place in Ukraine right now. So these cancer-causing chemicals are going to be floating around in Ukraine. It just shows that the U.S. does not care about Ukrainians. They don't care about freedom and peace and democracy for Ukrainians. They care about hurting as many Russians as possible, and they view the Ukrainians as indispensable. They don't care how many die. They're just trying to harm Russia, right? So what perfect weapon to give them? Depleted uranium. Sure, it's going to give more Ukrainians cancer. We don't care. We don't care as long as it's used against the Russians, right? From these people who tell us that they care so deeply about the Ukrainians. Or cluster bombs, right? Those could damage you. Those could kill Ukrainian citizens. Doesn't matter. U.S. doesn't care about Ukraine. Just cause as much damage to Russia as possible. And this shows that they didn't ever care about Kosovo. They cared about expanding NATO towards Russia's borders, expanding NATO's sphere of influence, which they did by dismantling Yugoslavia. NATO bombarded Yugoslavia for 78 days. without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. In total, NATO dropped 420,000 bombs, weighing 22,000 tons, including 15 tons of depleted uranium bombs. 15 tons. Over 2,500 people, including 79 children, were killed, and more than 1 million civilians, or maybe not 1 million civilians, what did it say? More than 1 million people. Keep in mind, this is what Slavoj Žižek and Vauš support while calling themselves Marxists. Support dropping depleted uranium on children. Oh, 1 million people became refugees. Got you. What is more heart-wrenching is that the death and agony brought by the war lingered for generations till this day. As noted by experts, exposure to radiation emitted by depleted uranium bombs can show no symptoms for years. And depleted uranium bombs have long-term impact on the environment and human food chain. Yeah, we didn't even talk about the environmental effects. Joe Biden, the anti-climate change president, sending depleted uranium to destroy the ecology of Ukraine. According to the Institute of Public Health of Belgrade, by the end of 2019, the number of registered cancer patients in Serbia was as high as 97,000. Crazy. A study of the Serbian Emergency Center shows that among children born in Serbia after 1999, many aged between 1 and 5 suffered from ectodermal tumors. Many aged between 5 and 9 contracted hematological malignancies. And there's a clear uptick in the morbidity rates of brain cancer among those aged between 9 and 18. Besides, by May 2019, 366 Italian military personnel who participated in the NATO military operations have died of cancer. And 7,500 have fallen sick. Just a coincidence, though. Just a coincidence. I'm sure it wasn't the depleted uranium. There were increased cancer rates not only among the people and increased adverse health effects not only among the people, but also the people who dropped the uranium bombs. Oh, it's just a coincidence. There's no correlation. Cover it up. Sweep it under the rug. However, till this day, the U.S., that's country that sent depleted uranium to Serbia, and the inventor of this type of bombs, as well as the only country who has ever used depleted uranium, continues to deny that depleted uranium bombs can directly cause Gulf War syndrome and Kosovo syndrome. During the Gulf War, the U.S. dropped far more depleted uranium bombs over Iraq. NATO is also trying to get away with it by claiming immunity from prosecution. Yes, that's something NATO does, even though everyone knows that NATO is led by the U.S., as the guy says here. What NATO will do is say, no, we're just a military alliance, right? We don't belong to any country, so you can't prosecute us. We're not subject to international law. We have impunity. We have immunity. We can do anything we want. We can destroy the nation of Libya. We can drop uranium bombs on children. We can ship uranium bombs to fascists in Ukraine. Doesn't matter. We're not tied to a country. You can't hold us accountable. That's what NATO does, and it prevents everyone from going, hey, the U.S. is doing that. That's being led by the United States. No, it's NATO. It's a defensive alliance. We're defensive. It's defensive to drop uranium on children. Such moves by the U.S.-led NATO are shocking. Neither the Serbian people nor people elsewhere in the world seeking justice will ever agree to this. The U.S.-led NATO should earnestly reflect on its war crimes and provide a reasonable explanation. There is none. They were just after money and competitive advantage and domination of the globe, and compensate the victims of the depleted uranium bombs as soon as possible. NATO must also seriously learn the lesson to stop creating new turmoil and division across the world. Stop sending uranium bombs to people across the world. So there you go. Not only has the U.S. given people cancer and birth defects and all these horrible things by dropping depleted uranium on them, but they've lied about it every step of the way. Why have they lied about it? So they don't have to compensate the victims, for one. And for two, they can keep using depleted uranium. They can send it to the Ukrainians. They can use it on their enemies. There's nothing wrong with it. They can have somebody come on AP News and lie about it, lie through her teeth, and claim that uranium isn't harmful and use a bunch of scientific jibber jabber and a few buzzwords to explain away the fact that the U.S. is bombing people with cancer-giving poison. If nature wanted us to be capitalist, she'd give us smaller brains. Scientific. Very true, Deanna. Thank you so much for the $30 or 30 PLN super chat. What's PLN? I'm sure I've looked this up before. You Polish zloty. Sweet. Cool. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm glad you figured out how to send super chats. YouTube wasn't letting you earlier. I'm sure that was the CIA intercepting all the funding y'all give to Midwestern Marx. Thank you so much, though. By the way, if you want to support our project, all of our money comes from small dollar donors like you. YouTube does take 30% of the super chats, just so you're aware. You can also support us on patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. If you're a $10 patron, you'll get a copy of Carlos's book. $10 YouTube members also get that. And every patron gets access to the Midwestern Marx Discord, which we will never take away from you. You'll always have access to that Discord. I just posted a new link the other day. It had been expired for a long time, but now it's not expired. Now you can join. And we thank you all for supporting. I also got to say, I don't know how I didn't bring this up, but we hit 36,000 subscribers on YouTube. We did it, everybody. We're the best around. Nothing's going to ever bring us down. So thank you all so much. Pretty dang exciting that an explicitly Marxist-Leninist YouTube channel in the Midwest, in the heart of the empire, in the belly of the beast, the heart of anti-communism, has achieved 36,000 subscribers. I'm pretty pumped about that. It's pretty cool. Obviously, at one point on TikTok, we had almost 400,000 subscribers or followers, but NATO and the powers that be, the ruling class, took over TikTok and systematically banned all the accounts like ours. But, you know, we rose from the ashes like a phoenix, and now we're continuing to combat the ruling class and continuing to grow. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't, or like and share the stream. Tell your grandparents and your friends and your family to subscribe. We really appreciate it. 40,000 subscribers is in our sights. We're going to hit it soon. Evening, my brother and sister comrades. Wow, thank you so much, David. I was just talking about Patreon. David was the original Midwestern Marx Patreon supporter. Thank you so much, David, for the super chat. Appreciate that. Again, all our funding at the Institute comes from people like you, so there's no way we'd be able to do our book projects, our publishing press stuff, or, you know, even our YouTube content and all the stuff we do without you guys. So thank you so much. I just got TikTok. My feed has been based AF. Good, yeah. It's all about what you like and who you follow. So yeah, thank you to all the super chatters today. Thank you so much to our moderators as well. Thank you to all the YouTube members, Twitch subscribers, and Patreon supporters, everyone who makes our Institute go round. Thank you to everyone who purchased a book. Watch the video of Parenti breaking with Bernie after the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, and he talks about the use of depleted uranium. Interesting. Yeah, I've seen that video, Jacob. Yep. Sad to say that, or sad to realize that Bernie voted for so many of these imperialist interventions. The video of him railing against the war in Iraq is so cool. But either way, y'all, I'm headed out. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one. I got practice. Oh, yeah. And tonight, don't miss it, 9 p.m., Carlos and I are talking with Roland Bohr, a theologian and expert on China. Really awesome scholar who Carlos and I have both read thoroughly and really enjoy and really like. He's really articulate, and he's going to teach us a lot. Tonight, he'll teach us a lot about Marxism and religion. Then the next time we talk to him, we'll just talk about China. And then there's another topic that we want to do. We want to do a trifecta, 3 interviews with him if possible. But this one will focus on religion. So peace out, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.
economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.